This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. The Revolution freezes over. Kronstadt, March 1921. The wind knifed across the Gulf of Finland, scouring the frozen bay. Petty Officer Stepan Petroshenko pulled his coat tight around his stiffening jaw and stared toward the faint smudge of lights on the horizon. If only they could reach the mainland, he thought. If their message spread, maybe the people would rise again. He peered through frost-bitten lashes at the sailors to his right and left, boots heavy on the groaning sea. They had once marched under the Red Banner in July and October through endless civil war. But somewhere along the way, the revolution had frozen over. The voice of the Soviets replaced by party orders, comrades by commissars. Stepan thought of the slogan painted on the fort wall: "All power to the Soviets, not the parties." The same words that had lifted them in 1917 now condemned them in 1921. The men moved across the ice in silence, rifle-slung breath crystallizing in the dark. Beyond the sleet wall, the guns of Petrograd waited. He had fallen, almost by accident, into leading the Kronstadt Commune. Thankfully, the other sailors agreed with him. They had to give the Bolsheviks an ultimatum, or nothing would change. They were not counter-revolutionaries. They wanted to save the revolution from the tyranny of parties. A week, he thought, a week will be enough. They set March the 10th as their deadline, but the answer arrived on the 5th. That morning, Stepan woke to a bruised horizon of gray and violet, the morning stars swallowed by the smoke over Petrograd. He knew that somewhere beyond that haze, the party spoke of discipline, loyalty, and betrayal. But here on the ice, the words meant little. A sailor approached and handed him an envelope. "They've replied," the man said, voice tight as a wire. Stepan broke the seal. Inside, the letter was short and formal, the Bolshevik stamp still wet. "By the order of the workers' and peasants' government, you are to lay down your arms and surrender the fortress immediately. Those who yield will be spared. Those who resist will be shot like partridges. Leon Trotsky." The words blurred in his vision. He felt the paper tremble in his hands. "So that's their answer," he murmured. "They call this unity?" In the radio room, the sailors drafted their own response. "We are not counter-revolutionaries. Not a single communist has been harmed by us. We fight for the true power of the Soviets." Two proclamations now carried on the wind, one backed by conviction, the other by artillery. The next week was a torment of hope and despair. Stepan told his men that Lenin and Trotsky could not speak for every comrade in the party. If they could just hold out until spring, he had said, reinforcements would come. They would storm Petrograd and return power to the unions, the communes, the Soviets. And for a moment it had seemed possible. The fortress held. Red Army ranks wavered. But then March 18th brought a final reckoning. Stepan looked in horror across the ice as thousands of Red Army troops fanned across the Gulf, artillery fire lighting the gray sky, armored cars grinding forward along gouged paths. "We must hold the line," he muttered to his lieutenant, half command, half prayer. When the guns awoke, they came with a fury few had imagined. Ice exploded into splinters. Men fell soundlessly into the black water below. By nightfall, the fortress, once called the pride and glory of the revolution by Trotsky himself, was a funeral pyre. With the Red Army closing in, Stepan and thousands of others fled across the ice toward Finland, knowing that capture meant certain execution. And as he looked back, the dawn light cut through the smoke just enough to reveal a red flag rising over the ruined fortress. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is Marxism versus Anarchism, the question of the state. The rebels of Kronstadt were defeated on March 18, 1921, exactly 50 years to the day after the Paris Commune had been declared. Watching from Petrograd, the Russian-American anarchist Emma Goldman had felt a rising dread. Deported from the United States during the first Red Scare, she had come to Soviet Russia as a believer, optimistic that the Bolshevik Revolution had finally fulfilled the promise of the Paris Commune. But by the spring of 1921, after a year of peasant uprisings, strikes, and the slaughter at Kronstadt, Goldman saw the revolution harden into one-party rule. Within months, she would leave Petrograd for Berlin. In the preface to her book, My Disillusionment in Russia, Goldman described her decision to go into exile. Quote, "Then came Kronstadt. It was the final wrench. It completed the terrible realization that the Russian Revolution was no more. I saw before me the Bolshevik state, formidable, crushing every constructive revolutionary effort, suppressing, debasing, and disintegrating everything. Unable and unwilling to become a cog in that sinister machine and aware that I could be of no practical use to Russia and her people, I decided to leave the country." In the years leading up to the 1917 Russian Revolution, Emma Goldman had become one of anarchism's most influential voices. Deeply inspired by the Paris Commune and its leaders, especially Louise Michel, whom she met shortly before Michel's death, she believed that the Russian Revolution marked the long-awaited triumph of equality and solidarity in the land of her birth. But like Michel before her, Goldman's experience ultimately left her embittered and disillusioned, convinced that it was not people but institutions that corrupted. Power, she concluded, could not be wielded on the people's behalf. It had to be abolished altogether. As in 1871, the events of 1921 revived that same fierce question of the left. Can the state be used to liberate the people? For Emma Goldman, and for many anarchists, feminists, syndicalists, and libertarian socialists, the answer after Kronstadt was that it could not. For them, the Bolshevik seizure of power had proven that the state would not liberate workers. It would simply change their masters. But Emma Goldman's early faith in the Bolsheviks reveals an important but often forgotten truth, that the split between Marxism and anarchism began as a family quarrel. Later polemics, especially after the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution, make it seem like Marxists and anarchists had always been sworn enemies. But really, they were not. Many early revolutionaries moved between these two camps with ease. Goldman herself, though anarchist to the core, welcomed the Bolsheviks at first. So too did her lifelong comrade and fellow anarchist Alexander Berkman. And when Berkman arrived with Goldman in Petrograd, he believed that the old feud between Marxists and anarchists had now been overcome, saying, quote, "From now on we are all one in the sacred work of the revolution. Socialists or anarchists, our theoretical differences are left behind. We are all revolutionists now." The Kronstadt sailors who rose up in 1921 against the Bolsheviks embodied this same dual lineage, for they were among the Bolsheviks' most devoted defenders, and at the same time deeply shaped by anarchist and libertarian socialist traditions. And this is not a story of naive anarchists being fooled by Marxist schemers. Lenin and Trotsky were never shy about their ultimate aims. Rather, it shows just how close these two traditions remained, even decades after the infamous split at The Hague in 1872 shattered the First International. So what this means is that the Marxism versus anarchism divide was never a clean rupture. It took decades and multiple revolutions to fully harden into two bitterly opposed camps. But still, that tension was there at the beginning. And to understand how this argument over the role of the state first formed, we need to go back to Paris in the spring of 1871, when the world's revolutionaries were still stunned by the brief fire of the Commune, which had, within weeks, snapped Europe from utopian possibility into reactionary terror. The fall of the Paris Commune in 1871 left Europe's left wing scattered and hunted. In France, tens of thousands were executed or imprisoned. Others fled to Switzerland, Belgium, and London. And the reaction was not confined to France. The brief life of the Commune had terrified Europe's monarchs. Across the continent, governments unleashed police raids, censorship laws, and secret trials to crush working-class politics once and for all.
This wave of repression was aimed squarely at the First International, which many conservative leaders blamed for inspiring the Commune. In truth, the uprising owed much more to homegrown French radicalism, to Blanqui, Proudhon, and the old Jacobin tradition, than to the Internationalist distant council in London. But perception mattered more than accuracy. To Europe's rulers, the red flag of Paris bore the International seal. That perception only deepened when the International's two most prominent figures, Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin, each claimed the Commune as a vindication of their own revolutionary ideas. As exiles poured into Geneva and London, fierce arguments opened up over what the bloodshed had meant. Some blamed the Commune's failures on its lack of discipline, others on its lingering faith in any form of state power at all. Out of the wreckage of the Commune, the International became a kind of parliament in exile for the workers' movement, a place where refugees, theorists, and trade unionists debated what socialism should become in an age of triumph and repression. By 1872, those debates would harden into two opposing camps. Marx and his allies in London called for tighter organization and a clear political strategy. Bakunin and his followers in the Swiss Jura and in Italy demanded autonomy and mistrusted all central authority. So the next Congress, set for The Hague, would not only seal the International's fate, but reshape the socialist movement for the next 50 years. The Fifth Congress of the International Working Men's Association was held from September the 2nd to the 7th, 1872, in The Hague, the Netherlands. By its close, the First International would split in two after a majority led by Karl Marx voted to expel Mikhail Bakunin and his anarchist supporters. This was not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of years of mounting tension. The fault lines had existed since the International's founding, but they had become visible at the 1869 Congress in Basel. As we discussed in What is Internationalism, Marx and Bakunin had actually found themselves briefly aligned against the French mutualists, the followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Their argument centered on collectivism. In short, Proudhon's followers envisioned progress through peaceful reform, localized individual exchange, small cooperatives, and mutual credit built within the shell of the old society. Marx and Bakunin rejected that gradualism. Both imagined a revolutionary transformation and pushed for the overthrow of capitalism and the creation of a new order based on collective control. The Basel Congress marked a shared victory for Marx and Bakunin over the mutualist line, and the International adopted collectivism as an official doctrine and established the goal that factories and farmland were to be held in common and directly managed by workers and peasants themselves. Yet once that principle was secured, the deeper divide emerged. For what exactly did collective control mean in practice, and how could it be achieved? Could a political party seize power on behalf of the people to push through collectivization? Or must workers and peasants take power for themselves? And if they did, who would they become after seizing power? Would they remain workers or transform into bureaucrats? These questions animated every Congress after 1869, and as the International expanded, they became less abstract and more immediate and practical, matters of internal governance as much as political philosophy. By 1871, on the eve of the Paris Commune, the International stood at its peak in terms of membership and influence. Its strategy of federating pre-existing workers' groups had fueled rapid growth, but it also left the General Council in London increasingly weak.
That weakness mattered because Karl Marx, by then the intellectual center of the movement, was at that moment trying to turn the council into a genuine coordinating body. For Marx's supporters, mostly working-class intellectuals from the German lands and trade union leaders in Britain, strong centralized leadership was essential. They argued that only a disciplined mass movement could conquer political power and begin remaking society. And the political climate seemed to support this strategy. In Germany, the newly founded Social Democratic Workers' Party, SDAP, was beginning to win some local elections. In Britain, trade union candidates were entering parliament and pushing for labor reforms. To Marx, these developments proved that the working class could become a political force within the state, if it acted collectively. But many of the later joining federations, especially in Switzerland, Spain, and Italy, viewed the London Council with deepening suspicion. They saw it as distant, bureaucratic, and increasingly authoritarian. With his revolutionary charisma and absolute opposition to hierarchy, Bakunin became the natural rallying point for this faction. Mikhail Bakunin's followers were not interested in taking orders from a council of theorists who knew little of their local struggles. So when delegates arrived at The Hague in September 1872, the real issue was not simply Marx versus Bakunin. Instead, it was the question of how the revolution itself should be organized. Interlude: A Babel of Tempers. The Hague, September 1872. Outside Concordia Hall, a dull gray sky hung over canals that churned quietly between walls of brick and stone. A salted wind pressed against thin window panes, barely muting the commotion within. Upstairs, some 70 delegates, mechanics, printers, artisans, crowded into a smoke-filled room alive with argument in half a dozen languages. In one corner, a cluster of Spanish, Swiss, and Italian workers in threadbare coats gestured furiously, demanding their words be translated to the English and German delegates at the front. Dressed in black coat and tie, Karl Marx sat with a weary grimace, watching the chaos unfold. Beside him, Friedrich Engels rifled through papers calling for order. The debates had dragged on for days. When Marx had read the roll of delegates to open the Congress, the followers of Bakunin protested, accusing Marx of stacking the list with allies who were not genuine members of workers' sections. Their objections had been drowned out each time by rapturous applause from Marx's supporters. Entire sessions vanished into quarrels over credentials and procedure. But now, on the fifth day of the Congress, the final motion was at last put to a vote. The question: whether to expel Mikhail Bakunin and his allies from the International. When the tally was read, 35 in favor, 6 opposed, 15 abstaining, the Bakuninists erupted. Shouts in Spanish, French, and Italian collided in the smoky air, a true babel of tempers. Among the Swiss delegates, James Guillaume rose to protest, insisting that the vote was invalid. But his words disappeared beneath the roar. And as the hall dissolved into chaos, Marx leaned toward Engels and muttered, "It's over. We've done our duty." Then he gathered his notes, rose, and left the hall in silence. The resolutions adopted at the close of the Hague Congress made the fault line between Marx and Bakunin unmistakable. Drafted by Karl Marx himself, the declaration read, quote, "In its struggle against the collective power of the propertied classes, the working class cannot act as a class except by constituting itself into a political party. This constitution of the working class into a political party is indispensable in order to ensure the triumph of the social revolution, and of its ultimate end, the abolition of classes. The conquest of political power has therefore become the great duty of the working class." In plain terms, the International would no longer be a loose federation of clubs and unions. It would now be a political movement, one aspiring to seize governmental power. Building on this, the Congress then expanded the authority of the General Council in London. The new statutes empowered it to, quote,
execute the Congress resolutions, and to take care that in every country the principles of the general rules and regulations of the International are strictly observed, and even, quote, to suspend branches, sections, federal councils, or committees and federations of the International till the meeting of the next Congress. Beneath the legal jargon, the change was revolutionary in its own right. What had begun as a federation of autonomous workers' groups, cooperating across borders through acts of solidarity, was now to become a centralized political organization, united under a single program and a single leadership. So, the age of revolutionary federalism had now given way to the era of party socialism. At the heart of this momentous shift in goals and methods of the International and the socialist left were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In the days that followed the Hague Congress, the expelled delegates began to regroup under the auspices of Mikhail Bakunin and his close ally, James Guillaume. Their influence had always been strongest in the Jura region of western Switzerland, a network of watchmakers, printers, and artisans whose workshops had become the cradle of anti-authoritarian socialism. And so, just weeks after The Hague, the Jura called a new Congress at Saint-Imier, a small mountain town near the French border. Bakunin, who had avoided The Hague out of fear of arrest, now took the lead. Beside him sat Guillaume, along with delegates from Spain, Italy, Switzerland, France, and even the United States, a roll call of the movement's most committed Federalists. Their first act was to formally reject the resolutions of The Hague. Then, in direct defiance of Marx's program, the delegates adopted their own declaration, saying, quote, "The destruction of all political power is the first duty of the proletariat. Any organization of a supposedly provisional and revolutionary political power can only be another deception, as dangerous to the proletariat as all the governments existing today." So, where Marx and Engels envisioned a disciplined movement seizing state power through political parties, the Saint-Imier Congress rejected party politics outright. Instead, they called for, quote, "the establishment of an absolutely free economic organization and federation based upon the labor and equality of all, and absolutely independent of any political government. This organization and this federation can only be the outcome of the spontaneous action of the proletariat itself, of trade unions and autonomous communes." In other words, the workers were not to conquer power. They were to abolish it. The Congress concluded with an invitation to all, quote, "free federations of workers to join a new pact of friendship, solidarity, and mutual defense, a gesture that symbolized not only a rupture within the left, but also the birth of a rival international, one built on the conviction that liberty could not be organized from above. In many ways, the split between Marx and Bakunin can be boiled down to a question of centralism versus federalism. For Marx, capitalism had already centralized economic life, in factories that crowded the cities, in railways that bound nations together, and in financial networks that stretched across borders. The great revolutionary task, then, was to seize that machinery from the exploiters and to place it in the hands of the producers themselves. The state, in this view, was a tool, dangerous, yes, but necessary for ultimately abolishing class altogether. For Bakunin, power itself was the disease. To seize it, even in the name of freedom, was to become infected by it. For him, the state could never serve as the instrument of liberation because it was born from domination. So the only cure was decentralization. Workers and peasants organizing themselves into federations of unions and communes, freely associating according to shared need and solidarity. Between these two visions, centralism and federalism, the socialist movement became permanently fractured. And every revolution, demonstration, election, and strike that followed would replay this same argument over and over again, in different tongues and under different flags. In the broadest sense, the split of 1872 created two great currents within working class politics.
Marxism and Anarchism. From these ideological seeds would sprout a forest of movements, some reformist, others revolutionary, many directly at odds with one another. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Marxism evolved into two principal branches. The first was social democracy, which sought to win power through the ballot box and legislative reform. The second, especially following the Russian Revolution of 1917, was Leninism, a model of centralized, disciplined party rule that would define the new Bolshevik state. So, from Marx's wing emerged both modern communism and social democracy. Meanwhile, Bakunin's descendants within anarchism turned their attention to the workshop and the factory floor. Convinced that trade unions themselves could become the skeleton of a new federalized society, they developed anarcho-syndicalism, a vision of social revolution achieved through industrial organization and the general strike. But another darker current also flowed from Bakunin's thought, what later came to be called the propaganda of the deed. In his Letters to a Frenchman on the Present Crisis, written amidst the upheavals that preceded the Paris Commune, Bakunin urged that revolutionaries must, quote, spread our principles not with words but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. Born out of an impatience with slow education and parliamentary reform, Bakunin's call for visible revolutionary action would soon take on new and more dangerous meanings. By the late 1870s, Italian and French anarchists had begun to interpret deeds as direct confrontations with state power, first in peasant uprisings and strikes, and then later in spectacular acts of violence meant to jolt society awake. And though carried out by a very small minority within the movement, these attacks, from the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 to the bombing of Wall Street in 1920, would terrify governments and stain the word anarchism for generations. For socialism's first generation, power had always been the enemy. From Babeuf to Blanqui, Proudhon to Louise Michel, Marx to Bakunin, socialism remained a dream eternally deferred, a vision glimpsed but never grasped. The Paris Commune of 1871, that fragile experiment of a mere 2 months, was the closest Europe's socialists ever came to building their ideal world. And it ended, as revolutions so often do, in blood and bitterness. And so it would fall to future generations to carry those dreams forward. In the century after The Hague, Marxism and anarchism remained the two great rivers of the socialist tradition, forever converging and diverging, both despising and needing each other in equal measure. No conflict would embody that love and hate, that tragic entanglement of discipline and freedom more than the Spanish Civil War, a final stage on which the descendants of both Marx and Bakunin would fight, and where an aging Emma Goldman would once again step forward, determined to help a new generation fulfill the promise of 1871. Epilogue: Liberty in a Burning House. Aragon, 1936. At 67, Emma Goldman's life had become a series of exiles. As a teenager, her Jewish family had fled the pogroms of Russia and settled in America. Just a year after her arrival, she was swept up by the Haymarket Affair, the trial and execution of Chicago labor activists that ignited the world's first May Day and set Goldman on the road to anarchism. 3 decades later, during the first Red Scare, Goldman was deported from the United States. Her citizenship revoked, she returned to the land of her birth, the new Soviet Union, only to watch the revolution harden into tyranny. After the massacre at Kronstadt, she left Russia disillusioned and adrift. Berlin, London, Toronto, never finding a place where she truly belonged. But now, stepping off the train near Huesca, with the foothills of the Pyrenees stretched before her in long green waves beneath a clear blue sky, she felt as if she had finally made it home.
Her guide, a young organizer for the CNT-FAI, led her through the collectivized farms and workshops. Warm and open, he embodied the solidarity she had spent a lifetime defending. Workers paused their machines and farmers their plows to greet the legendary defender of liberty. Walking through the collectives that day, she told them, quote, "Your revolution will destroy forever the notion that anarchism stands for chaos." The crowd laughed, cheered, and raised their hands in solidarity. For a moment, her vision and her reality seemed one and the same. Once back in London, Goldman published a bulletin in English defending the Spanish anarchists. But when the CNT-FAI entered a coalition with the Republican government and its Soviet-aligned allies, the old Bolshevik shadow loomed once more. With the memory of Kronstadt still fresh, she warned that cooperation with the communists was, quote, "a denial of our comrades in Stalin's concentration camps." When she returned to Spain a year later, the revolution was faltering, the fascists advancing and her comrades worn thin. She wrote to a friend that Spain had become like a house on fire. For Goldman, the Spanish Civil War truly was the last great cause. She died in 1940 as Europe once again descended into total war. The life of Emma Goldman traced the full arc of modern radicalism. She grew up under the shadow of the Paris Commune, inspired by figures like Louise Michel. She fought for emancipation and free expression in the factories and lecture halls of America, and she endured exile after Kronstadt and found brief redemption in the fields of Aragon. But the moment that first set her ablaze was Chicago, 1886, the Haymarket affair when workers and anarchists dared to confront America's industrial titans and demand the 8-hour day. And so, as we close this first season of ISM on socialism's first generation, we will journey next across the Atlantic to Chicago, where labor's great experiment met the machine age, the mob, and the mass strike. There, the same questions would echo. Can the state be used to liberate the workers, or must the workers abolish the state altogether? In our next season, we will follow that question into the birth of American anarchism, and into the furnace where the modern labor movement was first forged. So join me for Season 2, The Age of Anarchism, Chicago and the American Labor Revolt.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps des séries, où l'on s'en va de, puis mon rêve du pendant de rêve. Cerise d'Hermont, et rose pareil, tout bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps de série.
ISM is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the ISM Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.